The cartel drug war between Tijuana and Juarez is the deadliest cartel conflict in the modern history of North America. Over the course of nearly 3 decades, two rival criminal organizations fought a sustained, brutal war for control of the two most valuable drug trafficking corridors on the continent. Entire cities were turned into battlegrounds. Tens of thousands of people lost their lives, and the consequences of that war are still being felt today, on both sides of the border, in ways that most people have never fully understood. This was not a conflict that started overnight. It was built on a foundation laid in the 1980s by one man whose arrest fractured everything he had built and set the stage for everything that followed. It ran through the rise of the Arellano Flix brothers in Tijuana, one of the most feared criminal dynasties in the history of Mexican organized crime. It ran through the Lord of the Skies in Juárez, a trafficker who moved cocaine by the plane load and built a billion-dollar empire in the Chihuahua Desert. It ran through a street war so savage that a hitman's subordinate confessed to dissolving 300 bodies in acid. And it culminated in a 4-year siege of Ciudad Juarez that produced over 10,000 murders and made that city, by documented statistics, one of the most violent places on earth. But I assure you the real story lies deeper than any single headline ever captured. The territorial divisions drawn from inside a prison cell. The partnerships that collapsed into massacres. The enforcers whose methods were so extreme they became known by the nicknames their victims gave them. The government deployments that removed leaders without solving the problem. And the new organizations that moved into the vacuum and are fighting over those same corridors right now. That is what we are going to break down today. The full story, from the very beginning to the present. Before we get into the full breakdown, I need you to first understand why these two cities mattered above every other location in Mexico. Tijuana sits at the northwestern tip of Baja California, directly across the border from San Diego, California. Ciudad Juarez anchors the northern edge of the state of Chihuahua, separated from El Paso, Texas, by nothing more than the Rio Grande. These were not simply border towns. They were the two most critical overland drug trafficking entry points into the United States. Positioned at either end of the country's southern border, like the hinges on a door, worth hundreds of billions of dollars. San Diego and El Paso processed tens of thousands of vehicles and pedestrians every single day. A volume of legitimate commercial traffic so massive that concealing illegal shipments inside it became one of the central operational strategies of the entire modern drug trade. Whoever controlled Tijuana controlled access to California and the entire West Coast distribution network. Whoever controlled Juarez controlled access to Texas and the American interior. That is not simply valuable territory. That is the most valuable criminal real estate on earth. Now here is where the story actually begins. Not with the cartels themselves, but with the single man whose arrest created them. His name was Miguel Niel Flix Gallardo. Known throughout Mexico as El Padrino, the Godfather, Flix Gallardo was a former federal police officer from the state of Sinaloa who built the Guadalajara cartel into the dominant drug trafficking organization in Mexico during the 1970s and 1980s. He was the first major Mexican trafficker to establish direct partnerships with the Colombian cocaine cartels, and that connection transformed the economics of the entire industry. Before Flix Gallardo, the Mexican drug trade was primarily marijuana and heroin, significant money, but nothing compared to what was coming. After his Colombian alliances, cocaine began moving north in quantities that made every previous operation look insignificant by comparison. The profit margins were extraordinary, the demand in the United States was insatiable, and Flix Gallardo had positioned himself at the exact center of the supply chain, connecting South American production to North American consumption. At its peak, His organization controlled virtually every major trafficking corridor along the United States-Mexico border, and his political relationships extended so deep into Mexican government and law enforcement that he operated for years with near total impunity. He was not simply a drug trafficker. He was the man who organized Mexican drug trafficking into a modern industry, established its relationships with Colombian suppliers, negotiated its political protections, and distributed its territories in a way that kept internal conflict suppressed. The entire system depended on him at the center. That dependency was also the system's greatest vulnerability. April 8, 1989. That is the date everything fractured. Flix Gallardo was arrested in Guadalajara by Mexican federal authorities on charges connected to the 1985 murder of DEA agent Enrique Camarena Salazar, a case that had generated years of relentless bilateral pressure from the United States government. Camarena's kidnapping, torture, and murder had become a defining issue in U.S.-Mexico relations, and the pressure to produce accountability had been building for 4 years. The most powerful criminal in Mexico was suddenly behind bars, and the unified structure he had spent 2 decades building had no one at the center. It is worth noting that Flix Gallardo did not simply lose his influence upon arrest. For a period, he continued managing his organization from prison via mobile phone, a detail that reflects how deeply the system he had built depended on his personal authority rather than institutional structure. His initial sentence was 40 years. A 2017 retrial added an additional 37 years. He would spend decades inside, growing old and eventually nearly blind, while the organizations his arrest had created remade the criminal landscape of an entire continent. But when he was transferred to a maximum security facility where outside communication was severely restricted, the last thread holding the organization together as a unified entity was cut. What had been a single empire became a set of rival powers, and the border they had collectively controlled became a battlefield. From inside prison, Flix Gallardo made a decision that would determine the shape of Mexican organized crime for the next 30 years. He divided his territories among the most powerful figures in his organization, a deliberate partition intended to keep the business running without him. Baja California, including the critical Tijuana corridor, went to his nephews, the Arellano Flix brothers. The Juárez corridor in Chihuahua was allocated to the network that would solidify under the Carrillo Fuentes family. The Pacific Coast routes through Sinaloa went to a group of traffickers that included Ismael Zambada Garca and a man named Joaquin Guzmán Loera, who the world would eventually know as El Chapo. On paper, it was an orderly transition. In practice, it was the starting gun for the most violent era in the history of Mexican organized crime. But before the shooting started, there was a period of what analysts and historians have called the Pax Mafiosa, the Mafia Peace. For several years following Flix Gallardo's division of territories, a rough working equilibrium existed between the major organizations. The Tijuana cartel held Baja California. The Juárez cartel held Chihuahua. The Sinaloa network managed its Pacific routes. Each faction had its plaza and its profits, and the arrangement kept open conflict contained under a centralized understanding that each organization would respect the boundaries it had been given. That equilibrium was never built on trust. It was built on mutual interest. And the moment ambition outweighed mutual interest, every boundary Flix Gallardo had drawn became a line worth killing over. This is the part of the story that gets compressed in most retellings, so let me be specific about what the Pax Mafiosa actually meant and why its collapse was so consequential. During the early years after the 1989 division, the 3 major factions, Tijuana, Juárez, and the emerging Sinaloa network, operated in a kind of enforced coexistence. They shared certain logistics, respected corridor boundaries, and avoided the kind of direct confrontation that would have drawn unified law enforcement pressure down on all of them simultaneously. It was not peace in any meaningful moral sense. Violence still happened. People still died. But the organized, sustained, industrial-scale warfare that would define the following decade had not yet begun. The cartels were building their empires, consolidating their political connections, and establishing the financial and logistical infrastructure that would make those empires worth fighting over. When the infrastructure was built, when the corridors were fully operational, and the profits were flowing in quantities none of these organizations had ever seen before, the calculation changed. The pie was big enough that sharing it started to feel like losing. Now let us talk specifically about who the Tijuana cartel and the Juárez cartel actually were, because understanding what each organization built is essential to understanding why their conflict became so catastrophic. The Arellano Flix brothers moved into Tijuana and immediately began constructing what would become one of the most feared criminal organizations in North America. There were 7 brothers in the family, several sisters, but it was Benjamin and Ram who defined the organization's character. Benjamin was the architect, disciplined, strategic, the man who managed relationships with corrupt officials, built financial infrastructure, and kept the operation running as a coherent business. Ram was something categorically different. Ram was the enforcer, a man known for his personal willingness to participate in violence at a level that was unusual even within the world he operated in. Together, they built the Arellano Flix organization, the AFO, and by the mid-1990s, federal law enforcement on both sides of the border was describing it as one of the most powerful and most violent drug trafficking organizations on the continent. The AFO's operations moved multi-ton quantities of cocaine, marijuana, heroin, and methamphetamine across the border into California. Their corruption network reached from street-level contacts all the way up into senior positions in Mexican federal agencies and the judicial system. A joint DFBI task force established in San Diego specifically to target the AFO spent years documenting the organization's reach into American distribution networks across Southern California and beyond. But the detail that distinguished the Tijuana cartel from its contemporaries was a specific recruitment strategy that federal investigators documented extensively. The AFO was actively recruiting the children of middle and upper-class families on both sides of the San Diego-Tijuana border, educated young men with legitimate appearances, social connections, and access to networks that traditional street-level recruitment could not reach. These recruits, who became known as the juniors, became drug runners and enforcers not primarily for money, but for the reputation, for the identity of belonging to something that controlled the city around them. They attended universities, held legitimate jobs, socialized in circles no traditional cartel foot soldier could access, and used those positions to move product and intelligence across the border in ways that evaded standard law enforcement profiling. It gave the AFO a dual operational layer that made them significantly harder to dismantle. 700 miles to the east, a different kind of empire was taking shape in the Chihuahua Desert. The Juárez cartel had roots extending back to the 1970s, built on the foundation of traffickers connected to Flix Gallardo's original network. But the man who transformed it into a genuine continental power was Amado Carrillo Fuentes. He earned his nickname by doing something no Mexican trafficker had attempted at scale before him. He built a fleet of large commercial aircraft, Boeing 727 jets, and used them to transport cocaine directly from Colombia into Mexico in quantities that dwarfed what any competitor was moving. His nickname was the Lord of the Skies, and at his peak, he was believed to be the single wealthiest drug trafficker in Mexico, with a personal fortune estimated in the billions of dollars. He maintained the Juárez corridor as one of the most profitable trafficking routes on the continent through a combination of enormous financial resources, deep political connections, and a willingness to use violence strategically when no other option was available. The scale of what Amado built was reflected in the homicide statistics in Juárez during his tenure. In the mid-1980s, the city recorded fewer than 100 murders per year. By 1993, as Amado consolidated control and trafficking volume through the corridor expanded, homicides in Juárez surpassed 100 for the first time in recent history. From 1994 onward, they exceeded 200 annually, elevated, but still representing a period of relative organizational stability where the violence was primarily targeted and controlled rather than the indiscriminate urban warfare that would come later. July 1997, Amado Carrillo Fuentes was dead. The official account stated he suffered fatal complications during cosmetic surgery, an attempt to alter his appearance drastically enough to evade mounting law enforcement pressure. The circumstances were suspicious enough that questions were never fully resolved. 3 of the surgeons who operated on him were later found dead, their bodies showing signs of torture, which suggested someone held them responsible for what occurred on that operating table. His younger brother Vicente Carrillo Fuentes, El Viceroy, inherited the operation. Vicente was capable and determined, but he operated in the shadow of what his brother had built, and the empire he inherited had already begun to show structural stress that only becomes visible after the strongest person holding it together is gone. You see, what made this conflict uniquely deadly was not just the value of the corridors or the firepower of the organizations involved. It was the convergence of multiple simultaneous wars happening at the same time in adjacent geography, each feeding instability into the other. While Tijuana burned under El Teo's defection and Sinaloa's push into Baja California, Juárez was simultaneously collapsing under the weight of its own war with that same Sinaloa organization. Law enforcement resources on the Mexican side were stretched across 2 major theaters at once. Government attention was split. The cartels that might have checked each other instead created a situation where the chaos in one city amplified the chaos in the other. Understanding that overlapping structure is essential to understanding why the combined death toll reached the numbers it did. Here is the critical thing that most coverage misses entirely. The Tijuana cartel and the Juárez cartel were not simply 2 organizations fighting each other. They were 2 nodes in a broader war for control of the entire border, and their fortunes were intertwined in ways that went beyond any single bilateral conflict. Both organizations shared something fundamental. They had both been assigned their territories by the same man, both operated under the same original understanding of territorial sovereignty, and both faced the same existential threat when the Sinaloa cartel began pushing outward from its Pacific corridor and reaching toward the border crossings that Tijuana and Juárez controlled. The conflict that burned through both cities was in many ways the same war playing out on 2 separate fronts simultaneously, with the Sinaloa cartel as the aggressor on both, and the Tijuana and Juárez organizations as the defenders of corridors they had held since 1989. But the relationship between Tijuana and Juárez themselves was not cooperative. They were rivals. They competed for influence, logistics, and the trafficking relationships with Colombian and South American suppliers that both needed to keep their operations running. The Tijuana cartel and the Juárez cartel were listed as direct rivals in the intelligence assessments produced by American law enforcement agencies throughout the 1990s and 2000s. Both organizations understood that the other controlled a corridor of comparable strategic value, and that the financial and political relationships each had built could theoretically be leveraged to undercut the other. Their competition for corrupt government relationships, for the federal officials, military commanders, and law enforcement figures who could provide protection and intelligence, put them in direct opposition in the halls of Mexican power, even when their geographic territories did not overlap. This rivalry also shaped how each organization responded to the Sinaloa threat. Rather than coordinating a defense of their respective corridors, the Tijuana and Juárez cartels fought their battles independently, which meant that El Chapo's organization could engage them one front at a time without facing a unified opposition. The inability to cooperate, rooted in years of competition and mutual distrust, was itself one of the strategic factors that made both organizations vulnerable. An enemy that could have been faced together was instead faced separately, and the outcomes reflected that division. The peace between the Tijuana cartel and the Sinaloa organization collapsed first, and it collapsed with a moment so dramatic it forced the entire country to reckon with how far cartel violence had reached. May 24, 1993, at the Guadalajara International Airport, Cardinal Juan Jes Posadas Ocampo, the Archbishop of Guadalajara, was shot and killed in the parking lot. Mexican authorities would later maintain that the cardinal was caught in crossfire when gunmen dispatched by the Arellano Flix brothers were attempting to assassinate El Chapo, who was also at the airport that day. Whether that explanation fully captures what occurred has been debated by investigators, journalists, and legal scholars for decades. What is not debatable is what the killing demonstrated about the state of cartel violence by 1993. These organizations had reached a level of aggression and operational recklessness where a Catholic cardinal could be killed in a public airport in broad daylight, and the men responsible would continue operating for years afterward. The incident forced a major escalation in governmental and law enforcement attention toward the foe that would eventually begin dismantling the organization. The Arellano Flix family spent the final years of the 1990s and the early 2000s fighting a war on two fronts, against Sinaloa on the outside and against mounting law enforcement pressure from both governments. Then, in the span of a single month in early 2002, both pillars of the organization came down. February 2002, Ram Arellano Flix was killed in a confrontation with police in Sinaloa. Weeks later, Benjamin Arellano Flix, the strategic architect of the entire AFO, was arrested. The two men who had built the Tijuana cartel into the dominant criminal power in Baja California were gone within 30 days of each other. The organization that remained was fractured, leaderless at the top, and facing rivals who sensed weakness and were already positioning to exploit it. But here is the part that most people overlook. The most dangerous figure in the Tijuana cartel's history was not one of the Arellano Flix brothers. He was a man who had worked beneath them, and he was about to make the entire situation infinitely worse. Teodoro Garca Cimental, known as El Teo, had been born in Culiac, Sinaloa, the same state as the rivals his employers were fighting. He had risen through the AFO as an enforcer, and his capacity for violence made him one of the most operationally valuable figures in the organization. But it was not the volume of his violence that would make him internationally notorious. It was the methodology. El Teo employed a subordinate, who became known in the media as El Pozolero, the soup maker, a man named Santiago Mesa, who later confessed to Mexican authorities that he had dissolved the bodies of approximately 300 people in barrels of caustic soda and water over nearly a decade of working for Garca Cimental. 300 people. Dissolved, no physical evidence, no remains. Just men who had crossed the Tijuana cartel simply ceasing to exist, their bodies reduced to liquid in industrial drums. When El Pozolero was arrested and made his confession in 2009, the revelation generated headlines around the world and placed El Teo's operation at the center of one of the most disturbing criminal investigations in Mexican history. If you take the time to do the research, you can find that El Teo's story does not end with El Pozolero's arrest. It escalates. When Eduardo Arellano Flix, another of the brothers still active in the organization, was arrested in October 2008, a power struggle erupted inside the already fractured AFO between El Teo and Luis Fernando Snichez Arellano, a younger family member attempting to claim control. El Teo did not wait to see how that struggle resolved. He broke away entirely, took his faction with him, and forged an alliance with the Sinaloa cartel, the same organization the Arellano Flix brothers had spent 2 decades fighting. The move converted what had been an internal organizational dispute into an open street war in Tijuana, with El Teo's forces now operating alongside El Chapo's network against the very cartel they had previously served. Violence in Tijuana spiked to levels that shocked a city already accustomed to cartel violence. Kidnappings, beheadings, broad daylight shootings became near daily events. January 12, 2010, El Teo was captured. Mexican federal police raided a vacation home near La Paz at the southern tip of the Baja California Peninsula in the early morning hours, and Teodoro Garca Cimental was taken without a shot fired. He was flown to Mexico City and presented to cameras in handcuffs, wearing a red sweatshirt, carrying over $34,000 in cash. It was the end of one of the most violent individual careers in the history of the Tijuana conflict. The Sinaloa cartel would ultimately establish dominance over the Baja California corridor. The AFO survived in diminished form, reduced to cells rather than the empire the Arellano Flix brothers had built. While all of that was unfolding in Baja California, a war was beginning 700 miles to the east that would dwarf everything that had come before it in terms of sheer human cost. The rupture between the Juárez and Sinaloa organizations had been building since 2004. For a period in the early 2000s, El Chapo and the Juárez cartel had maintained a federation, a cooperative arrangement in Chihuahua that allowed both organizations to profit from the corridor without direct conflict. El Chapo himself had proposed it after his 2001 escape from a high-security Mexican prison, concealed in a laundry cart, one of the most audacious breaks from custody in the history of organized crime. The arrangement worked, briefly. Then in September 2004, Rodolfo Carrillo Fuentes, Vicente's younger brother and a key operational figure in the Juárez organization, was shot and killed along with his wife as they left a movie theater in Culiacan. Fingers pointed at El Chapo as having ordered the assassination. The Carrillo Fuentes family responded in kind, and the retaliatory cycle that followed killed significant numbers on both sides while stopping well short of the all-out war that was coming. The back and forth from 2004 to 2007 was bloody but contained, a simmer, trading strikes without committing the full weight of either organization to a single decisive confrontation. By 2005, residents of Ciudad Juarez were already noticing a heavier Sinaloa cartel presence in the city, an advance guard quietly building the logistical foundation for what would follow. By 2007, that presence had grown visible enough that the direction of events was clear to anyone paying attention. Then, in 2008, El Chapo turned up the heat all the way. The Sinaloa cartel launched a full-scale offensive to seize the Juárez corridor by force. They deployed a paramilitary enforcement arm called La Gente Nueva, the new people, trained, equipped, and tasked specifically with challenging the Juárez cartel's territorial control. Vicente Carrillo Fuentes responded with everything he had. The Juárez cartel activated La Línea, the line, a unit composed largely of corrupt and former Chihuahua state police officers with military training and an intimate operational knowledge of the city. La Aldea formed an alliance with the Barrio Azteca, a Mexican-American prison and street gang with deep roots on both sides of the El Paso-Juárez border, capable of operating across international lines in ways purely Mexican organizations could not. What followed was referred to in Juárez simply as La Guerra, the war. The statistics from this period are staggering, and I want you to actually sit with them rather than let them pass by as abstract numbers. In 2006, Ciudad Juarez recorded approximately 300 homicides for the year. By 2008, as the Sinaloa offensive began in earnest, that number was already climbing sharply. In 2010, at the peak of the conflict, more than 3,000 people were murdered in Ciudad Juarez in a single year. Official Mexican government figures would later confirm that over 10,000 people died violently in the city between 2008 and 2012. 10,000 people in 4 years in one city. To put that into context, that averages to more than 6 murders every single day for 4 consecutive years, in a city of roughly 1.3 million people, significantly higher than the casualty rates in many declared war zones during the same period. The violence reached into every layer of civilian life in ways that went far beyond what most conflict reporting conveyed. Cartels targeted rivals in restaurants, hospital parking lots, and outside schools. They targeted police officers suspected of cooperating with the other side. So many officers were killed that the Juárez police force was functionally paralyzed at points during the conflict. They executed business owners who refused extortion payments. They hung narco banners across major intersections, declaring territorial control and threatening anyone who cooperated with their enemies. But some of the most shocking incidents involved mass killings at locations where civilians gathered with no connection to the cartel war at all. Drug rehabilitation centers in Juárez were targeted on multiple occasions. Gunmen entered these facilities and executed patients inside. Incidents that produced international outrage and underscored just how completely the cartel war had broken the boundaries between combatants and civilians. Social gatherings were attacked. In January 2010, gunmen opened fire on a house party in the Villas de Salvarcar neighborhood, killing 15 young people, most of them students with no criminal affiliations. That massacre became one of the defining atrocities of the entire conflict, a moment that forced both the Mexican government and international observers to confront the full extent of what the war in Juárez had become. Families fled by the thousands. Entire neighborhoods emptied as residents relocated across the international bridge to El Paso, seeking safety. Schools emptied. International manufacturing facilities that had drawn workers from across Mexico began losing staff who could no longer tolerate the conditions. Journalists who attempted to report on cartel activity were threatened, attacked, and killed. Newspaper offices received warnings. Editors made the calculation that publishing certain stories was a death sentence and pulled them. The atmosphere of terror that enveloped the city during the peak years of the conflict was not incidental to the cartel's strategy. It was the strategy. Controlling civilian behavior through fear was as operationally important to both sides as controlling territory. Because a population, too, frightened to cooperate with law enforcement, was a population that could not threaten cartel operations. The Mexican federal government's response, under President Felipe Calderón, involved military deployments on a scale that was extraordinary by any standard. Tens of thousands of soldiers and federal police were positioned in Ciudad Juarez at various points during the conflict. Operations produced significant arrests and removed key figures from active leadership. Vicente Carrillo Fuentes himself was eventually captured in October 2014 at a routine traffic checkpoint in the northern city of Torreon, after an 11-month investigation that identified vehicles he used and homes he visited. The FBI had offered $5 million for his capture. The DEA called him one of history's most notorious drug traffickers. He faced charges in United States federal courts for murder, attempted murder, trafficking, and money laundering. The Juárez cartel survived his arrest, but emerged severely fragmented and weakened, its dominance over the Chihuahua corridor broken in ways it has never fully recovered from. But ironically, capturing leaders created as many problems as it solved. Every time a major figure was removed, a vacuum formed. The competition to fill that vacuum generated new cycles of violence as subordinates and rivals fought over the resources left leaderless. The kingpin strategy, concentrating enforcement resources on taking down individual leaders, could destabilize an organization in the short term, while simultaneously fragmenting it into multiple competing cells that were in some ways more difficult to manage than a single hierarchical structure. Researchers and law enforcement analysts debated for years whether the approach reduced violence or simply redistributed it, and the evidence from both Tijuana and Juarez suggested that the answer was complicated enough that no simple operational conclusion applied. The only question left to answer about what happens next lies in the emergence of an organization that neither the Tijuana cartel nor the Juarez cartel had anticipated when they were building their empires in the 1990s. The Jalisco New Generation Cartel, CJNG, arose in the early 2010s from the collapse of a smaller trafficking group called the Milenio Cartel. Led by Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, known as El Mencho, the CJNG expanded across Mexican states with a speed and organizational capacity that distinguished it from anything that had preceded it. By the middle of the decade, it was competing directly with the Sinaloa cartel for the most valuable corridors on the continent, and it was doing so with a level of military-grade weaponry and tactical sophistication that reflected how dramatically the capabilities of major Mexican criminal organizations had evolved since the days of Benjamin and Ram Arellano flicks. Around 2016, the CJNG moved specifically to exploit the weakened state of the old AFO in Baja California. Narco banners appeared in Tijuana, declaring the birth of a new regional entity, the Tijuana New Generation Cartel, formed from the alliance between CJNG resources and what remained of the Arellano Flicks network. The combination gave the CJNG a foothold in a corridor it could not have penetrated on its own, and gave the AFO remnants the organizational backing and financial resources they needed to remain relevant against a Sinaloa cartel that had dominated the plaza for years. In Chihuahua, reports similarly emerged of CJNG establishing footholds through alliances with factions of La NEA, the enforcement arm that had survived the broader fragmentation of the Juárez cartel structure following Vicente Carrillo Fuentes' arrest. Security analysts tracking violence levels in Tijuana documented a 16% increase in clashes between armed groups and targeting of civilians between mid-2024 and early 2025 compared to the prior 8 months, a reflection of how active the contest for Baja California remains. The modern conflict along the border is no longer a two-cartel rivalry with clearly defined front lines. It is a multi-organization contest involving shifting alliances, fragmented local groups, internal defections, and new criminal formations competing for the same geographic choke points that have been contested since 1989. To understand why that contest never resolves, you have to understand the economics at a level that most coverage never reaches. The San Isidro port of entry between San Diego and Tijuana is the busiest land border crossing in the world. The volume of legitimate commercial traffic is so enormous and so difficult to inspect completely that even a small percentage of successfully concealed shipments represents billions of dollars in revenue for the organizations that manage to move them through. Highways and rail lines connect Tijuana directly to Los Angeles and the broader California distribution network. Ciudad Juarez connects to Texas, and from there to the entire American interior. Criminal organizations that control those entry points control the first link in a supply chain that reaches every major American city. That is not a local asset. That is a nationally strategic position worth any amount of resources and any level of violence to hold. The emergence of synthetic opioids, particularly fentanyl, has intensified these economic stakes beyond what the cocaine wars of the 1990s ever generated, because synthetics can be manufactured at a fraction of the cost and moved in quantities small enough to be nearly impossible to detect. In recent years, fentanyl and synthetic opioids have been responsible for over 70,000 overdose deaths annually in the United States, the overwhelming majority of that supply moving through the same corridors the Tijuana and Juarez cartels spent decades building and defending. The war has changed form. The drugs are different, but the corridors are the same. It is worth pausing here to acknowledge something that gets lost in the coverage. Both Tijuana and Ciudad Juarez are major cities with millions of residents who lived through these conflicts as ordinary people trying to maintain ordinary lives under extraordinary conditions. Tijuana is one of the most economically dynamic cities in Latin America, a major manufacturing hub, a cultural center, a city of nearly 2 million people, the vast majority of whom have no involvement in organized crime. Ciudad Juarez is home to major international manufacturing facilities, universities, and a population that demonstrated remarkable civic resilience in rebuilding public life after the worst years of the war subsided. Homicide rates in both cities declined significantly after the peak years. In Juarez, murders fell from over 3,000 in 2010 to under 300 by 2015, one of the most dramatic reductions in urban violence ever documented. That reduction reflected real changes in the criminal landscape and real investment in security and social programs. But the cartel presence in both states has never disappeared, and the United States Department of State maintains active travel advisories for the states of Baja California and Chihuahua, reflecting the ongoing risks associated with organized crime activity in those regions. Those advisories are updated regularly, and anyone traveling to either area should check the current State Department Mexico travel advisory before making plans, because conditions vary significantly across neighborhoods and change over time. And here is something no one actually talks about. While the peak years of violence in both Tijuana and Juarez have passed, the problem is not finished. The organizations are still operating. The corridors are still contested. The Jing is still expanding into both regions. Fentanyl is still crossing those borders. The war has changed form. It has not ended. In some respects, measured by the body count it produces on both sides of the border combined, it has never been more lethal than it is right now. The fentanyl crisis unfolding in American communities today is, in a direct and documentable line, a consequence of the corridor infrastructure that the Tijuana and Juarez cartels built, defended, and bled for across 3 decades of war. Tijuana and Juarez are not closed chapters in a history book. They are cities where the contest that began when Flix Gallardo divided his empire in 1989 is still being fought, in altered form, by altered organizations, over the same geography and the same economic logic that started everything. The names have changed. The methods have evolved. The drugs are different. But the underlying calculation, control the corridor, control the profit, control the power, is exactly what it was the day this all began. And the communities that live inside those corridors, on both sides of the border, continue paying the price for a conflict that was never about them, and that has never fully been resolved. Records show that at the height of the Juárez War, the city became the reference point international security analysts used to benchmark urban violence anywhere in the world. Not a war zone in the military sense, but in every measurable human cost, functionally indistinguishable from one. That is the scale of what the war over these two corridors produced, and that is why this conflict, above every other chapter in the history of the Mexican drug trade, remains the one that defined what cartel warfare actually means. What are your thoughts on the cartel wars that reshaped Tijuana and Juárez? And which side of this conflict do you think history will judge most harshly? Drop your perspective in the comments below, and make sure you subscribe and click on the content on screen for more deep dives into the most significant criminal organizations and conflicts that have shaped the modern world.